The moment I stepped off the transport bus after 5 years of peacekeeping duty overseas, my boots barely touching the gravel of my hometown driveway, I saw my wife standing on our porch in a white sundress, laughing at something the man beside her had said, and that man was wrapping his arm around her waist like he belonged there, like 5 years hadn't just vanished from my life while I was dodging landmines and burying friends in foreign soil. And when I looked closer at his face, my blood went cold, because it was Victor Doyle, the same boy who used to shove my face into the mud behind our middle school and steal my lunch money every single day until I was 14 years old. Before I tell you what I did next, and before your heart breaks the way mine did that afternoon standing in my own front yard like a stranger, I want to ask you something. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that even the deepest wounds can heal into something stronger than before, if you believe that forgiveness is not weakness but the bravest thing a person can ever choose, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our community grows stronger every time you do, and honestly, stories like mine only mean something when they're shared with people who still believe that broken things can be mended. Now let me take you back to where it all began, because you need to understand who I was before you can understand who I became. My name is Nathan Hargrove, and I grew up in a small town called Millbrook, the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, where the diner on Main Street served the same meatloaf special every Wednesday for 30 years, and where the biggest excitement of the year was the county fair in late summer. I was a scrawny kid, the kind who got picked last for kickball and who spent recess reading comic books under the oak tree instead of playing with the other boys. My father worked at the lumber mill until his back gave out, and my mother cleaned houses 3 streets over to make ends meet. We didn't have much, but we had enough love in that little house to fill a mansion twice over, and that love is what carried me through the years when Victor Doyle made my life a living hell. Victor was everything I wasn't. He was tall for his age, broad-shouldered even in middle school, the son of the man who owned the hardware store and the auto shop on the edge of town. His family had money, and Victor knew it, and he used it like a weapon against anyone who didn't measure up to his standards. I still remember the day in 6th grade when he cornered me by the bike racks and told everyone within earshot that my mother scrubbed toilets for a living, and when I tried to defend myself, he shoved me so hard into the chain-link fence that I still have a small scar above my eyebrow from where the metal cut through skin. That was the first of hundreds of humiliations I endured at his hands over the years, and by the time we reached high school, I had learned to make myself as small and invisible as possible just to survive each day. The one bright spot in all that darkness was Margaret Hollis, though everyone called her Maggie. She lived 2 houses down from mine, and we had been friends since we were 6 years old, building forts out of couch cushions and catching fireflies in mason jars during summer evenings. Maggie had the kind of laugh that made you forget your troubles, a laugh that started somewhere deep in her chest and spilled out until her whole face lit up, and she had this stubborn kindness about her that made her defend the underdog even when it cost her socially. She was the only person who ever stood up to Victor Doyle on my behalf, telling him to his face in 9th grade that he was nothing but a coward who needed other people to feel small so he could feel big, and though it didn't stop his cruelty, it meant the world to me that someone saw me as worth defending. By the time we graduated high school, Maggie and I had become inseparable, and somewhere along the way, our friendship deepened into something neither of us had words for at first. I remember the exact moment I realized I loved her, standing in the parking lot after graduation, watching her toss her cap into the air with pure joy on her face, and thinking that I wanted to spend the rest of my life making sure that joy never faded. We dated through community college, saved every penny we could from our part-time jobs, and got married in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church on Elm Street when we were both 23 years old. Her father walked her down the aisle in his old Sunday suit, and my mother cried through the entire ceremony, and I remember thinking that I was the luckiest man alive, because after years of feeling small and unworthy, I had found someone who made me feel like I mattered. We settled into a modest life in Millbrook. I worked as an electrician's apprentice, slowly building toward my own certification, and Maggie taught 2nd grade at the elementary school we had both attended as children. We bought a small house with a crooked front porch and a garden out back where Maggie grew tomatoes and sunflowers every summer. Life wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, and it was good. We talked about starting a family, about growing old together on that same porch, watching our children play in the same yard where we had once caught fireflies as kids ourselves. Then, when I was 28 years old, an opportunity came through a program connected to the National Guard unit I had joined years earlier for extra income and a sense of purpose, offering a position on an international peacekeeping mission overseas. The pay was significant, more than I could earn in 3 years as an apprentice electrician, and the mission length was set at 18 months with the possibility of extension. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with Maggie, spreading brochures and paperwork across the surface, trying to explain why this mattered to me. It wasn't just about the money, though the money would help us buy a bigger house, maybe even help her open the small tutoring center she had always dreamed of running. It was about proving to myself that the scrawny, bullied kid from Millbrook could do something brave, something that mattered on a scale larger than our small town. Maggie held my hands across that table, tears in her eyes, and told me she was scared but that she believed in me, and that she would be waiting for me no matter how long it took. What neither of us anticipated was that 18 months would stretch into 5 long years, as unit rotations were extended, as conflicts flared unexpectedly in the region where I was stationed, and as communication became increasingly difficult and sporadic due to security protocols. The first year apart was hard but bearable. We wrote letters, and when satellite phones were available, we spoke for precious few minutes at a time, always rushed, always aware that the connection could drop at any moment. I missed her with an ache that settled into my bones, but I clung to the promise of our reunion, counting down days on a small calendar I kept folded in my jacket pocket. Then, 6 months into my deployment, everything changed during what should have been a routine patrol near a contested border region. Our convoy struck an improvised explosive device, and though I survived, I was severely injured, drifting in and out of consciousness for weeks in a military hospital overseas. Due to a catastrophic administrative error, combined with the chaos of mass casualties from that same incident, my family back home received notification that I had been killed in action. I did not learn until much later, once I had regained enough strength to understand what had happened, that a memorial service had been held for me in Millbrook, that my mother had collapsed at the news and had to be hospitalized for a week from the shock, that Maggie had worn black for months and visited an empty grave marker the town had erected in my honor. By the time the error was discovered and corrected, nearly 4 months had passed, and I was still in recovery, unable to communicate clearly due to the severity of my injuries and the sedation required for multiple surgeries. When I finally regained enough cognitive clarity to request contact with my family, I was told that due to security protocols surrounding the incident and an ongoing investigation into the administrative failures that led to the false notification, direct communication would be delayed further while the situation was formally resolved through official channels. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I certainly had to. Imagine waking from a haze of pain and fear only to learn that the people who love you most in this world believe you are dead, and that you cannot immediately reach out to tell them otherwise. By the time the paperwork was finalized and I was cleared to send a message home, nearly 7 months had passed since the incident, and Maggie had already begun the slow, painful process of grieving me and rebuilding her shattered life. When my letter finally arrived, informing her that I was alive, recovering, and would eventually be coming home, I later learned that she fainted upon reading it, that my mother had to call the school to explain why Maggie couldn't teach that day. The military extended my recovery and subsequent deployment due to the medical situation and shifting mission requirements, and rather than allowing me to return home immediately, I was reassigned to a support role at a base further from the conflict zone once I had sufficiently healed, a role that stretched my total time away to 5 years instead of the 18 months originally planned. Throughout this extended period, communication remained difficult, often limited to brief letters that took weeks to arrive, and I did not know the full extent of what was happening back home in Millbrook during those years. What I did not know, what I could not have known from thousands of miles away with only fragments of information reaching me through delayed mail, was that Maggie's grief and subsequent guilt over feeling relief and confusion at my survival had created a complicated emotional storm inside her. She had already begun to rebuild a life without me. During those months she believed me dead, leaning heavily on our small community for support, including, unexpectedly, on Victor Doyle, who had returned to Millbrook a changed man after his own father's hardware store went bankrupt and his parents divorced acrimoniously when he was in his early 20s. Victor had spent years working through his own demons, eventually training as a grief counselor after volunteering at a crisis center helped him confront the anger and insecurity that had fueled his cruelty as a child. When Maggie was drowning in grief over my presumed death, it was Victor, of all people, who showed up at her door with casseroles and quiet company, who sat with her through panic attacks, who helped her navigate the mountain of paperwork that comes with a spouse's death, all while carrying his own guilt over the boy he used to torment. I learned all of this only after I returned home, piecing together the story from my mother, from Maggie herself, and eventually from Victor, in conversations that were among the most painful and revealing of my entire life. But standing in that driveway on the day I finally came home, none of that context existed for me yet. All I saw was my wife, the woman I had survived war and grief and years of separation to return to, standing wrapped in the arms of the boy who had made my childhood a nightmare. The shock hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I simply could not process what my eyes were showing me. I remember dropping my duffel bag onto the gravel, the sound of it hitting the ground seeming impossibly loud in the sudden silence that fell over the yard as Maggie turned and saw me standing there. Her face went through an entire spectrum of emotion in the span of seconds. Shock first, her mouth falling open as if she had seen a ghost, which in some sense she had, given that she had mourned me as dead for months. Then joy, raw and overwhelming, breaking across her features as tears sprang to her eyes and she took a step forward. But that joy was immediately followed by horror, a dawning realization of the impossible situation she now found herself in, standing between the husband she thought she had lost forever and the man she had, in the depths of grief and loneliness, eventually married 18 months after receiving the false notification of my death. I watched all of this happen on her face in real time, and I felt something inside my chest crack open, a mixture of confusion, betrayal, and a grief so profound it stole the air from my lungs. Victor's reaction was different but equally telling. He went pale, his arm dropping from around Maggie's waist as if he had been burned, and he took a step back, putting distance between himself and Maggie in a way that felt almost instinctive, an old habit of a man used to being blamed for things. I could see the recognition in his eyes too, the same recognition of the boy he had once tormented now standing before him as a grown man in a soldier's uniform, weathered and changed by 5 years of hardship. For a long moment, none of us said anything at all. The only sound was the wind moving through the oak trees that lined our street, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barking, oblivious to the devastation unfolding in our front yard. It was my mother who broke the silence, coming around the side of the house with a basket of laundry in her arms, freezing mid-step when she saw me standing there. The basket slipped from her hands, clothes spilling across the grass, and she let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, rushing forward to wrap her arms around me as if she needed to confirm with her own hands that I was real, that I was truly standing there and not some cruel figment of grief-stricken imagination. Over her shoulder, I watched Maggie and Victor, watched the way they seemed to be having an entire silent conversation with just their eyes, and I felt a fresh wave of that same crushing betrayal wash over me. What followed in the hours after my arrival was a blur of raised voices and tears, of Maggie trying desperately to explain the impossible circumstances that had led her to this moment, of my own anger and hurt making it nearly impossible for me to hear anything she said with an open heart. I remember sitting at that same kitchen table where we had once spread brochures about my deployment, now feeling like a stranger in what used to be our home, listening as Maggie explained through broken sobs about the false notification, about the memorial service, about the months of grief so profound she had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, nearly stopped functioning entirely until Victor's persistent, patient kindness had slowly pulled her back from the edge of complete collapse. I did not want to hear it, not at first. Every instinct in my body screamed at me that this was a betrayal, that no amount of grief or confusion justified marrying the boy who had tormented me throughout my childhood, the boy whose name alone brought back memories of humiliation and pain I had spent years trying to overcome. I stood up from that table so abruptly that my chair clattered backward onto the floor, and I walked out of the house without another word, driving to the edge of town where an old fishing spot on Miller's Creek had always been my refuge as a boy whenever Victor's bullying became too much to bear. I sat on the bank of that creek for hours as the afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky, casting long shadows across the water, trying to make sense of a world that had shifted so completely beneath my feet. It was there, sitting on that familiar creek bank, that I allowed myself to truly feel the full weight of everything I had lost and everything I had survived over the past 5 years. I thought about the friends I had buried overseas, young men who would never come home to anyone at all. I thought about the months of pain and confusion after my injury, waking up in that hospital bed not knowing if my family believed me alive or dead. I thought about Maggie's face when she had seen me in the driveway, the genuine, overwhelming joy that had broken across her features before horror set in, and I forced myself to consider, really consider, what those months must have been like for her, believing her husband dead, grieving alone in a town where every street corner probably held a memory of us together. I want to pause here and ask you directly, because I have asked myself this same question countless times since that day. What would you have done in her position? If the person you loved most in the world had been declared dead, if you had buried an empty casket and worn black for months, if a friend from your painful past had shown up not with cruelty but with genuine kindness and patience during the darkest period of your life, would you have been able to resist the slow pull toward healing that such kindness offers, even if it came from an unexpected source? I am not asking you to excuse betrayal, because in many ways, what happened felt exactly like betrayal to me in that moment. But I am asking you to consider the complexity of human grief, the way it can make us vulnerable in ways we never anticipated, the way healing sometimes comes from the most unlikely places. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon that afternoon, I heard footsteps approaching along the creek bank, and I turned to find Victor Doyle standing a respectful distance away, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression carrying none of the arrogant cruelty I remembered from our childhood. He asked if he could sit, and against every instinct that told me to send him away, I found myself nodding, curious despite my anger to hear what he might say. We sat in silence for a long moment, the creek water moving steadily past us, before Victor finally spoke, his voice quiet and measured in a way I had never heard from him before. He told me that he understood if I hated him, that he probably deserved whatever anger I wanted to direct at him, not just for what had happened with Maggie but for the years of cruelty he had subjected me to as a child. He explained, haltingly at first and then with growing openness, about his own painful adolescence that I had never known about a father who drank too much and belittled him constantly, about the way he had learned to project that same cruelty onto anyone he perceived as weaker than himself, believing on some subconscious level that if he made others feel small, it would somehow make his own pain more bearable. He told me about his parents' divorce, about the hardware store's bankruptcy, about hitting his own personal rock bottom in his early 20s and finally seeking help through a crisis counselor who had, ironically, helped him see the pattern of pain he had been perpetuating throughout his life. He explained that when he heard about my death, something in him had wanted to make amends for the cruelty of his childhood, even though I would never know about it, even though it wouldn't undo the years of harm he had caused. He had started by simply checking in on Maggie, bringing food during those first devastating weeks, and somewhere in the months that followed, as they leaned on each other through shared grief over a town they both loved and a person they had both, in very different ways, cared about, something had shifted between them that neither had fully anticipated or, in the beginning, wanted. He told me, with what seemed like genuine remorse rather than self-justification, that he understood if I could never forgive him, that he would step back from Maggie's life entirely if that was what needed to happen for me to have any chance at reclaiming what I had lost. I sat there listening to him, feeling the anger inside me war with a growing, unwelcome sense of empathy, because I recognized something in his story that I hadn't expected to recognize. I remembered, suddenly and vividly, a moment from our childhood that I had nearly forgotten, a day when I had seen Victor's father screaming at him in the parking lot of the hardware store, calling him worthless in front of several other kids from school, and I remembered feeling, even then, a flash of pity beneath my fear and resentment. I had never connected that memory to his cruelty toward me, had never considered that the boy who hurt me was himself deeply hurting, but sitting on that creek bank as an adult, hearing his story, I found myself unable to hold on to my anger with quite the same ferocity as before. That did not mean the pain of the situation disappeared, not by any means. I still had to return home that evening, still had to face Maggie and the impossible tangle of love, loyalty, and legal complications that our situation now presented. As it turned out, because I had been declared dead through an administrative error rather than through any legitimate legal process, and because Maggie's marriage to Victor had occurred based on that false information, the marriage itself existed in a strange legal gray area that would need to be formally addressed through the courts. But more than the legal questions, what mattered most in those early days was the emotional reality that three people's lives had become impossibly intertwined by circumstances none of us had chosen or could have anticipated. Over the following weeks, which all took place during the bright, unhurried days of early autumn in Millbrook, as golden leaves began drifting from the oak trees along Main Street, I found myself in the strange position of needing to rebuild not just my marriage but my entire understanding of what had happened during my absence. Maggie and I spent long afternoons sitting on our porch, the same crooked porch where we had once dreamed of raising children together, as she told me in painful detail about those months of grief, about the moment she received the folded flag at my memorial service, about the way our small community had rallied around her with casseroles and sympathy cards that felt like small knives each time she opened one. She told me about the crushing loneliness of those nights, about staring at my side of the bed and feeling a hollowness so complete she sometimes wondered if she would ever feel whole again. She explained, with tears streaming down her face during one particularly difficult conversation, that her relationship with Victor had developed slowly, almost accidentally, built not on romance at first but on shared grief and mutual healing. She told me she had fought against her growing feelings for him for months, feeling as though acknowledging them would be a betrayal of my memory, but that eventually, worn down by loneliness and touched by his patient, gentle presence during her darkest days, she had allowed herself to consider a future that included him. She married him, she explained, not out of any diminished love for me, but out of a genuine belief that I was gone forever and that she deserved, after so much grief, a chance at happiness again. When my letter arrived informing her I was alive, she told me she had felt a joy so overwhelming it nearly broke her, immediately followed by a guilt so crushing she could barely function, torn between the husband she had thought dead and the man she had built a new life with in the aftermath of that loss. I listened to all of this with a heart that ached in ways I had not anticipated. Part of me wanted to hold on to my anger, to insist that nothing could justify what had happened, that 5 years of separation and a cruel administrative error did not erase the vows we had made to each other. But another part of me, the part that had survived war and injury and had spent years contemplating what truly mattered in life, recognized the impossible situation Maggie had found herself in, recognized that grief makes us vulnerable in ways that logic cannot always account for, and recognized that the woman sitting across from me on that porch had suffered profoundly during my absence, even if her suffering had taken a different shape than my own. During this same period, I also began reconnecting with my mother, spending long mornings at her kitchen table hearing her account of those difficult months, of how she had nearly lost her own health to grief before I was found alive, of how she had watched Maggie's slow transformation from a shattered widow into someone who had found unexpected healing through an unlikely friendship that grew into something more. My mother, in her practical wisdom, told me something that stuck with me through the following weeks. She said that life rarely follows the neat paths we imagine for it, that sometimes the people who hurt us in one chapter of our story become unexpectedly important in another, and that holding on to anger, however justified it might feel, would only prevent me from finding peace in whatever came next. I also spent time, more than I initially expected to, in conversation with Victor himself, as the strange practical realities of our situation required us to navigate shared concerns, particularly regarding a daughter I had not known existed until my 3rd week back in Millbrook. Maggie told me, during one of our porch conversations, with a trembling voice and tear-filled eyes, that she had been pregnant when I deployed, though she hadn't known it yet at the time I left, and that our daughter, whom she had named Eleanor after my grandmother, had been born 7 months into my deployment, months before the false notification of my death had even reached her. This meant that Eleanor had spent the first years of her life believing, as much as a small child could understand such things, that Victor was her father, since he had entered Maggie's life not long after Eleanor's birth and had been the only father figure the child had ever known. This revelation hit me harder than almost anything else in those difficult weeks. I had a daughter, a child I had never met, who was now nearly 5 years old and called another man daddy. When I first met Eleanor, in the living room of the house Maggie and Victor had shared, I felt a complicated storm of emotions I had never anticipated needing to navigate. She was a beautiful child, with Maggie's same infectious laugh and a stubborn curiosity that reminded me achingly of myself as a boy. She looked at me with the polite, cautious curiosity of a child meeting a stranger, and something inside my chest broke all over again, grieving for the years of her life I had missed, for the first steps and first words and childhood milestones that had happened without me, for the simple fact that this child, my own daughter, did not know me at all. It would have been easy, in that moment, to let bitterness consume me entirely, to demand that Victor step away from Eleanor's life immediately, to insist on my rightful place as her father regardless of the emotional cost to a 5-year-old child who had only ever known one version of family. But as I watched Eleanor climb into Victor's lap that afternoon, watched the easy affection between them, the gentle way he brushed her hair back from her face when she leaned against his chest, I understood that I could not simply erase the only father she had ever known from her life without causing her profound and unnecessary harm. This realization forced me to confront a question I had never expected to face, which was whether my own hurt and sense of rightful ownership over my family mattered more than what was truly best for an innocent child who had done nothing to deserve the impossible situation adults around her had created. Over the following months, still entirely within the bright, unhurried days of that autumn stretching into a mild winter in Millbrook, I made the difficult decision to prioritize slow, patient relationship building with Eleanor rather than forcing an immediate, disruptive change to her understanding of family. I began visiting regularly, first for short afternoon visits, then for longer stretches, allowing her to grow comfortable with my presence at her own pace rather than my own. I learned to sit on the floor of her playroom, building elaborate block towers that she delighted in knocking down, learned her favorite stories and the specific way she liked her sandwiches cut into triangles rather than squares, learned the shape of her laugh and the particular stubbornness she had inherited from both her mother and, I suspected, from me as well. During this same period, Maggie and I began the slow, painful work of deciding what our marriage would become. We attended counseling sessions together at a small practice 2 towns over, wanting privacy from the watchful eyes of our close-knit community, and through those sessions, facilitated by a counselor who specialized in exactly the kind of complicated grief and reunion trauma we were experiencing, I began to understand more fully the depth of Maggie's suffering during my absence and the genuine, if complicated, love she still carried for me even as she had built a new life with Victor. Slowly, through many difficult conversations, we began to rediscover the connection that had first brought us together as children catching fireflies in mason jars, the deep friendship and understanding that had formed the foundation of our marriage long before either of us understood what romantic love truly meant. Victor, for his part, showed a remarkable and, I'll admit, unexpected grace throughout this entire process. Rather than fighting to hold on to Maggie or asserting his rights as Eleanor's legal father during that period, he consistently prioritized what seemed genuinely best for both Maggie and Eleanor, even when that meant accepting profound personal loss for himself. During one particularly difficult conversation between the two of us, sitting once again on the bank of Miller's Creek where our first honest conversation had taken place, Victor told me that he had married Maggie believing wholeheartedly that I was gone forever, and that he had loved her, and continued to love both her and Eleanor deeply, but that he recognized the marriage existed in a fundamentally different context now that I had returned. He said something that I still think about often, that loving someone sometimes means recognizing when your presence in their life, however well-intentioned, might be standing in the way of a more complete healing that only reuniting with their original family could provide. This did not mean the resolution came easily or without significant pain for everyone involved. Victor grieved the loss of the family structure he had built with Maggie and Eleanor, and I watched him struggle visibly during the weeks when the legal proceedings to annul his marriage to Maggie were finalized, watched him fight back tears during Eleanor's 5th birthday party when she called out for him excitedly to see her blow out her candles, uncertain of what role he would be permitted to continue playing in her life going forward. I found myself, surprisingly, feeling genuine compassion for his pain rather than the satisfaction I might have expected to feel at his loss. Perhaps it was because I recognized in his grief an echo of my own suffering, the pain of loving someone deeply and facing an uncertain future regarding that love. It was during this period that I made a decision that surprised even myself, one that I discussed at length with Maggie before moving forward, which was to invite Victor to remain a consistent presence in Eleanor's life, not as her father in a legal or primary sense, but as what we began calling her Uncle Victor, a trusted family friend who had cared for her during her earliest years and whose continued presence would provide stability rather than additional loss during an already confusing transition. This decision was not made lightly, and I will admit that some part of me still wrestled with resentment toward Victor for the childhood cruelty I had endured at his hands, resentment that did not simply evaporate because he had shown unexpected kindness toward my wife and daughter during my absence. But I recognized that Eleanor's well-being mattered more than my own lingering grievances, and that punishing Victor by removing him entirely from her life would primarily punish an innocent 5-year-old who loved him. If this part of the story is resonating with you, if you're finding yourself moved by the idea that even people who have hurt us can change, that grief and circumstance can create impossibly complicated situations that require grace rather than simple judgment, I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please take a moment to like this video if you believe healing is possible even in the most complicated circumstances, and consider sharing it with someone in your life who might need to hear that forgiveness, though difficult, can open doors that anger keeps permanently closed. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel, because we share stories like this one regularly, stories about the messy, beautiful, complicated ways that people find their way back to hope even after devastating loss. As winter gave way to the first hints of spring in Millbrook, with crocuses beginning to push through the softening ground along Main Street and the days growing gradually longer and brighter, Maggie and I made the decision to renew our commitment to each other through a small, private ceremony in our backyard, the same yard where Eleanor now played on the swing set Victor had built for her years earlier. We did not want a large celebration, given the complicated emotions still surrounding our reunion, but we wanted to formally recommit ourselves to the marriage that had somehow survived 5 years of separation, false grief, and the impossible complications that followed. My mother stood beside us as our only witness, along with Eleanor, who wore a small flower crown and scattered rose petals with the gleeful abandon only a 5-year-old can bring to such a solemn occasion. In the months that followed, I completed my transition back to civilian life, finally earning the electrician certification I had been working toward before my deployment, and began building a small but steady business installing and repairing electrical systems throughout Millbrook and the surrounding towns. Maggie returned to teaching 2nd grade, and Eleanor started kindergarten that following autumn, walking into her classroom with the same fearless curiosity her mother had shown as a child. Victor, for his part, continued his work as a grief counselor, eventually opening a small practice in town specifically focused on helping families navigate exactly the kind of complicated loss and reunion trauma that our own family had experienced, drawing on his own painful journey to help others facing similarly impossible circumstances. Perhaps the most unexpected development in all of this was the friendship that slowly, cautiously developed between Victor and myself over the following year. It began simply, with him stopping by occasionally to see Eleanor, staying for a cup of coffee at Maggie's insistence, until eventually those visits became a regular part of our lives, with Victor joining us for Sunday dinners and important milestones in Eleanor's life. I will not pretend that every trace of old resentment disappeared entirely, that I never felt a flash of old pain when I remembered the boy who had shoved me into that chain-link fence years ago. But I came to understand that the man sitting across from me at our dinner table, patient and gentle with my daughter, genuinely remorseful for his childhood cruelty, was not the same person who had tormented me decades earlier, and that holding on to anger toward who he used to be would only poison the present we were all trying to build together. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after my return to Millbrook, Victor and I found ourselves alone at that same fishing spot on Miller's Creek where we had first spoken honestly with each other after my homecoming. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water move past us in the bright afternoon sunlight, before Victor finally spoke, telling me that he had never properly apologized for the years of bullying he had subjected me to as a child, that he understood no amount of subsequent kindness could erase that harm, but that he wanted me to know how genuinely sorry he was for the pain he had caused a boy who had never deserved such cruelty. I found myself, in that moment, offering him something I never expected to give freely, which was complete and unreserved forgiveness, not because his past actions no longer mattered, but because I recognized that both of us had grown into people capable of choosing kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, and that this growth mattered more than holding on to old wounds that no longer served either of us. I want to pause here, near the end of this story, and ask you to consider something important before we reach our conclusion together. Have you ever had to forgive someone for something that once felt unforgivable? Have you ever found unexpected grace in a situation that seemed impossibly complicated, where anger would have been the easier path but healing required something far more difficult? I would love for you to share your own experience in the comments below, because I believe these stories of forgiveness and second chances matter most when we recognize we are not alone in navigating them. Eleanor is 8 years old now, a bright, imaginative child who loves reading adventure stories and asking endless questions about the world, questions that remind me constantly of my own childhood curiosity before Victor's bullying taught me to make myself small and invisible. She calls me Dad now, a transition that happened gradually and naturally over those first 2 years, without any pressure from Maggie or myself, simply through the accumulated weight of countless afternoons spent building block towers and reading bedtime stories and pushing her on that same swing set in our backyard. She still calls Victor her Uncle Victor, and their relationship remains warm and important to her, a testament to the fact that love, when approached with genuine grace rather than possessive jealousy, can expand to include more people rather than requiring exclusion and competition. Maggie and I recently celebrated what we now count as our true anniversary, not the date of our original wedding all those years ago, but the date of our backyard recommitment ceremony that marked our conscious choice to rebuild our marriage despite everything that had happened between us. We spent that evening, once the sun had set and Eleanor was tucked safely into bed, sitting on our same crooked front porch, holding hands and reflecting on everything our family had survived to reach this point of hard-won peace. She told me that she still sometimes feels guilt over those years she spent believing me dead, over the choices she made during her grief, and I have learned to respond to that guilt not with reassurance that dismisses her pain, but with genuine understanding that acknowledges how impossibly difficult those circumstances truly were, circumstances that neither of us chose and that ultimately, through great effort and grace on everyone's part, led us to a deeper and more resilient love than we had known before. Victor recently got married himself, to a kind woman named Charlotte who works as a nurse at the regional hospital, and Maggie and I attended their wedding with genuine joy, watching a man who had once caused me such profound childhood pain now stand at an altar promising his life to someone who clearly saw the good in him that had always existed beneath the cruelty of his troubled youth. Eleanor served as their flower girl, scattering petals down the aisle with the same joyful abandon she had shown at our own backyard ceremony years earlier, a living symbol of how thoroughly our once impossibly tangled lives had woven themselves into something resembling an unconventional but genuinely loving extended family. If you have made it this far in our story, I want to thank you sincerely for taking this journey with me, and I want to ask you one final time, before we close, to consider what this story might mean for your own life. Perhaps you are carrying anger towards someone who hurt you deeply, anger that feels justified and necessary to protect yourself from further pain. Perhaps you are struggling to understand how someone you love could have made choices that felt like betrayal during circumstances beyond anyone's control. I am not suggesting that every situation deserves forgiveness, or that every relationship can or should be rebuilt after profound hurt. But I am suggesting, based on everything my family has survived together, that grace and understanding, difficult as they are to extend, often open doors to healing that anger and judgment permanently close. Before we end this story together, I would genuinely love for you to leave a comment sharing what forgiveness has meant in your own life, or what lesson from this story resonated most deeply with you, because these conversations matter, and I read every single one of them with gratitude for our growing community here. I came home 5 years after leaving for a peacekeeping mission that changed my understanding of courage and sacrifice, only to find my wife had married my childhood bully during a period of grief neither of us could have anticipated or controlled. In that first devastating moment in our driveway, I could never have imagined the path that would lead our family to the peace we now share, a peace built not on the absence of pain, but on the conscious, difficult choice all three of us made, again and again, to prioritize love, understanding, and the well-being of an innocent child over our own justified grievances and hurt pride. Our family looks different than I ever imagined it would when Maggie and I first married beneath that Methodist church steeple all those years ago, but I have come to believe it is stronger for having survived what could have destroyed it entirely, stronger because we chose, each of us, in our own ways and in our own time, to extend grace when anger would have been so much easier. If this story touched your heart even a fraction as much as living through it touched mine, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson or emotion that resonated with you most, share this story with someone in your life who might need a reminder that broken things can be mended, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about the messy, beautiful, redemptive power of forgiveness and second chances. Our community continues to grow because of viewers like you who believe, as I have come to believe through my own impossible journey, that even the deepest wounds can heal into something stronger than before, that even our most painful childhoods and most devastating losses can eventually give way to unexpected grace, and that home, in the truest sense, is not a place we return to unchanged, but a peace we build together, one difficult, courageous choice at a time.